The ships were found locked in the ice, perfectly preserved. A ghost fleet in a world of white. On board the HMS Terror, plates were still set on the officers' tables, a meal interrupted and never finished. A half-drunk glass of wine, frozen solid. Clothes lay neatly folded in chests. Books sat on shelves, their pages fused into blocks of ice, waiting for readers who would never return. But there were no people, not a single soul. The two most advanced polar vessels on Earth, the Erebus and the Terror, were silent tombs, frozen in time. Aboard them, 129 men of the British Royal Navy had sailed into the Arctic labyrinth to conquer the Northwest Passage. And then, they simply vanished from the face of the Earth. For years, the world waited. These weren't just any sailors, they were the best of the best, led by the celebrated veteran explorer Sir John Franklin. Their departure from England was a national event. Crowds cheered. They were heroes setting off on a mission of imperial pride, to chart the final unnavigated section of a legendary sea route. They were equipped with the best technology the British Empire could provide. Their hulls were reinforced with iron plates to smash through ice. They had internal steam heating systems to fight the crushing cold. They carried a library of over 1,000 books. And most importantly, they had enough canned food to last for 3 years. Failure wasn't just unlikely, it seemed impossible. They were expected back in a year, maybe 2, as conquerors. But the Arctic doesn't care about technology or national pride. It's a patient killer. The first winter passed, no word. Then a second. The confident silence from the Admiralty turned to nervous whispers. Letters from worried families went unanswered. The public grew restless. The Admiralty, embarrassed and now deeply concerned, launched one of the largest search efforts in history. Ship after ship sailed into the white maze, captained by men who knew the risks. They pushed their own crews to the limit, searching every barren coastline, every frozen channel. They found nothing. No wreckage, no notes, no survivors. It was as if the ships and all 129 men had been swallowed by the ice. The first real clues didn't come from the official rescue parties. They came from the people who lived there. Inuit hunters who had seen things no one from Europe could comprehend. They spoke of a ship trapped in the ice off an island they called King William. They told stories of white men walking south. But these weren't explorers, they were ghosts. Thin, skeletal figures stumbling across the frozen sea. Their faces were blackened by frostbite and the smoke of their fires. Their clothes were in rags. And their eyes, the hunters said, were wild, their minds broken by the cold and the endless glaring sun. They were starving and they were dying. They couldn't even hunt. They just walked. Years later, guided by these chilling stories, searchers finally reached the island. And there, they found the first signs of the horror. They found a single lifeboat, not in the water, but bizarrely mounted on a heavy wooden sledge. It was meant to be dragged across hundreds of miles of ice. The sheer effort would have been immense, a task for healthy men, not the starving figures the Inuit described. And what was inside? Not food, not tools, not anything that could save them. Inside were 2 skeletons surrounded by the most useless items imaginable for survival. Silver forks, soap, sponges, silk handkerchiefs, and heavy books. What were they thinking? Why waste their last ounces of strength dragging luxury items across a frozen hellscape? It was the first sign that their minds had shattered long before their bodies gave out. Miles away, the discoveries grew darker. More bodies were found. Skeletons lying where they fell, all of them facing south, part of a desperate last march to nowhere. And on the bones, they found something else. Something that would send a shockwave through polite Victorian society. Deep, deliberate cut marks, scrape marks on the ribs, bones cracked open. The evidence was undeniable.
analyzed by doctors back in London who could barely believe what they were seeing. The crew of the Franklin expedition hadn't just starved. They had been driven to the last, most terrifying human taboo. They had eaten each other. How could this happen? How did two state-of-the-art ships, packed with enough food to last for years, end up as frozen coffins for a crew that turned on itself? What terrible chain of events pushed these disciplined, professional sailors to madness, desperation, and cannibalism? This case defies all logic and pushes the human spirit to its breaking point. It's a journey into the darkest corners of survival. To join us on future expeditions into the unknown, subscribe to the channel right now. Now, to understand how it all went so wrong, we must go back to the beginning. Back to a time of hope, ambition, and a single fatal oversight. A hidden poison that doomed them all before they even left port. The year was 1845. The British Empire was at the peak of its global dominance. Its ships ruled the waves, its flag flew on every continent. But there was one last unconquered frontier, a final defiant blank space on the world map, the Northwest Passage. For centuries, this mythical sea route through the Arctic archipelago had obsessed explorers. It was a phantom, a frozen labyrinth that promised a shortcut to the riches of Asia. Finding it wasn't just about trade. It was about national pride. It was the final geographical prize, and Britain intended to claim it. The man chosen to lead this monumental undertaking was Captain Sir John Franklin. He was a national icon, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, and a seasoned Arctic explorer. At 59 years old, this was to be his crowning achievement, the final glorious chapter in a celebrated career. He was given the very best the Empire could provide. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. These were not ordinary vessels. They were war machines repurposed for a battle against nature itself. Their hulls were reinforced with thick beams of oak, and their bows were plated with sheets of iron, designed to act as battering rams against the relentless sea ice. They were equipped with the latest technology. A steam engine and propeller on each ship, allowing them to push through calm, frozen waters when the sails were useless. They even had a primitive central heating system to fight off the deadly cold. On paper, these ships were indestructible fortresses against the ice. His crew was the cream of the Royal Navy. 129 officers and men, all hand-picked for their skill, strength, and courage. They were the best of the best. Young men burning with ambition, dreaming of the fame and promotions that would come with conquering the passage. As they prepared to depart, all of England was caught in a wave of patriotic fervor. They were celebrated as heroes before they even set sail. They left port to the sound of cheering crowds and cannon salutes, utterly convinced of their success. They were heading into the most hostile environment on Earth, but they felt invincible. To ensure their survival for the projected 3 years of the voyage, they carried a revolutionary invention: canned food. This was the key to everything. Previous expeditions had been ravaged by scurvy, a horrific disease caused by a lack of vitamin C that made gums rot and old wounds reopen. Starvation was the other great fear. But with over 8,000 tins of preserved meats, soups, and vegetables stacked in their holds, these men believed those ancient horrors were a thing of the past. This food was their shield. It was their guarantee of life. It was also their execution order. The contract to supply the expedition was awarded to a man named Stephen Goldner, and it was given at the last possible minute. He had only a few months to produce thousands of cans. The deadline was impossible. To meet it, he cut corners. His workers, paid by the number of cans they could seal, worked frantically. Quality control was non-existent. Their primary goal was speed. To seal the lids onto the tins, they used a thick, heavy solder made of lead. And they were sloppy. Instead of a neat, clean seal on the outside, they slathered it on, letting the molten poison drip down the inside of the cans, where it cooled and solidified directly into the food. Every can of beef, every tin of soup was laced with a neurotoxin. From the moment they left England, with every meal they ate, the men of the Franklin expedition were slowly, systematically poisoning themselves. The lead didn't kill them quickly. It was a silent, invisible assassin. It crept into their bloodstreams and settled in their bones. It began to attack their nervous systems. The men would have felt it first as persistent headaches, which they likely blamed on the sea. Then came the fatigue, a deep, unshakable weakness they would have attributed to the hard work. Soon after, their minds would have started to fray. They would become irritable, argumentative. Paranoia would begin to fester in the dark, cramped quarters of the ships. Their ability to think clearly, to make rational decisions, was being eroded with every bite. The very provisions meant to keep them strong were driving them mad. They sailed north into the vast, white emptiness, completely unaware that their fate had already been sealed. The greatest enemy they faced wasn't the crushing ice or the sub-zero temperatures. It was already inside their bodies, ticking away like a time bomb. The time bomb detonated in September 1846. The ships, Erebus and Terror, had pushed deeper into the Arctic labyrinth than any before them. They were navigating a channel called Victoria Strait, a passage that seemed to promise a way through. But the Arctic is a patient hunter. The temperature dropped. The sea, once a dark, moving liquid, began to change its texture. It became thick like syrup, slowing the ships to a crawl. The sound of the hull scraping against new ice was a constant grating noise. At first, it was just a nuisance. Then, the sound changed. It became a deep, groaning complaint as massive sheets of ice began to form, locking together like pieces of a puzzle. Within days, the puzzle was complete. The sea was gone, replaced by a solid white plain that stretched to every horizon. The groaning of the ship's timbers became a scream as millions of tons of ice squeezed the hulls. They were stuck. 129 men on 2 wooden ships were now prisoners of the ice. Their world had shrunk to the length of their decks. The first winter was a descent into a special kind of hell. In November, the sun dipped below the horizon and did not return. The world was plunged into a perpetual twilight, a crushing, monotonous darkness that lasted for months. Time itself seemed to dissolve. Was it morning? Was it night? The only light came from flickering whale oil lamps that coated every surface with a greasy black soot. The cold was a physical presence. It wasn't just cold, it was an active, aggressive force that sought to steal the life from their bodies. Temperatures dropped to 40, then 50 degrees below zero. A man who exposed his skin for more than a minute would be left with waxy, white patches of frostbite. The wood of the ship would crack like gunshots in the night. Inside, condensation froze on the walls, coating their sleeping quarters with a layer of ice. They were living inside a freezer. But the real enemy was already inside their minds. The lead poisoning was now in full, terrifying effect. The disciplined chain of command, the very thing that holds a naval crew together, began to rot from within. Men who had been professional sailors became unpredictable. An officer would give a clear order, and a crewman would stare back with empty eyes, unable to process the command. Sudden, violent rages would erupt over nothing: a stolen biscuit, a perceived insult. Paranoia became a plague. Men would huddle in corners, whispering about conspiracies, convinced that certain officers were hoarding food or planning to abandon the rest. The officers, their own minds clouded by the poison, struggled to maintain control. Their judgments became erratic. They couldn't distinguish between genuine insubordination and the ravings of a sick mind. The ships, once models of British naval order, were becoming floating asylums. Then, a new horror emerged: a medieval disease they had only read about in books, scurvy. Their bodies began to fall apart. It started in their mouths. Their gums swelled, turning a dark purplish black, and bled constantly. Their teeth loosened in their sockets until they could be pulled out with their fingers. The pain was excruciating. Then it spread. Their joints swelled, making every movement an agony. Old wounds, scars that had been healed for decades, would mysteriously reopen and begin to bleed as if the injury had just happened. The ship's surgeon was helpless. He watched men decay while they were still breathing, their bodies literally decomposing. The stench of sickness and death filled the cramped lower decks. Hope arrived with the spring sun in 1847. The ice began to crack. The sound of moving water beneath them was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. A desperate energy seized the crew. They worked with a feverish intensity, sawing through massive blocks of ice, trying to clear a path. But the ice was a cruel jailer. It loosened its grip, but it never let go. The entire ice pack, with the ship still trapped inside it, began to drift. They were moving, but they were not free. For the entire summer, they were teased with the illusion of escape, only to find the horizon remained a solid wall of white. Then they saw the sun getting lower on the horizon again. The days grew shorter. The cold returned, more bitter than before. The ice began to thicken, the cracks sealing over. The horrifying realization dawned on every man. They were not getting out. They were facing another winter. This time, there was no hope. They were weaker, sicker, and their canned food, the very source of the poison, was running low. The madness that had been simmering for a year was about to boil over. On June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin, the commander of the expedition, died. The man who was supposed to lead them to glory had succumbed to the same slow, agonizing decay as his men. His death was the final blow. They were now leaderless, trapped in the dark, and their ordeal was just beginning. With their commander gone, the chain of command shattered. Captain Francis Crozier was now in charge, but his authority was a ghost. He was just another starving man in a floating tomb, surrounded by 100 other men losing their minds. Paranoia became the new captain. It coiled in the perpetual twilight of the second Arctic winter, a darkness that lasted for months. Men who had been comrades now eyed each other's meager rations with suspicion. A cough in the dark sounded like a threat. Whispers echoed through the frozen corridors of the ships, but no one could be sure if they were real or just tricks of a mind poisoned by isolation and lead. The cold was a living entity. It wasn't just outside, it was inside the ships, inside their clothes, inside their very bones. It was a deep, relentless ache that never subsided. Frostbite was a silent thief. A man would look down and see his fingers had turned a waxy, dead white, then a sickening black. There was no pain, just a horrifying numbness, the feeling of his own body dying in pieces. Scurvy rotted them from the inside. Gums swelled into purple sponges, bleeding constantly, filling their mouths with the coppery taste of their own decay. Teeth loosened and fell out, clattering onto the wooden decks. The lead in their tinned food continued its silent, devastating work. It didn't just make them sick, it unmade them. It frayed the connections in their brains. Men would forget their own names. They would stare blankly when given a simple order. Some would fly into sudden, inexplicable rages, while others would sit for hours, rocking back and forth, lost in a waking nightmare. They spent that second winter watching their friends die, one by one. The bodies, frozen solid within minutes, were too hard to bury in the iron-hard ground. They were simply wrapped in canvas and left on the ice, a growing collection of frozen statues marking their failure. When the sun finally returned in the spring of 1848, it wasn't a symbol of hope. It was a cruel spotlight. The weak light streamed through the portholes, illuminating the full horror of their situation. The gaunt, hollowed-out faces, the filth, the despair. The survivors were barely human. Just over 100 men remained. Crozier looked at them and knew the ships were no longer vessels of exploration. They were coffins. Staying meant a slow, certain death by disease and starvation. They had one last desperate choice. On April 22, 1848, he gave the order that sealed their fate. Abandon ships. They would walk south. They would attempt to march hundreds of miles across the barren, unforgiving ice to a river, a faint hope of finding help from fur traders or native hunters. It was a suicidal plan, born of absolute desperation, but it was the only plan they had. Before they left, they wrote a final, chillingly formal note. They recorded the date of Franklin's death and the number of men already lost. They sealed it in a metal cylinder and placed it in a stone cairn, a final message from a dying world. Then, the madness of their situation became truly clear. They began to load the heavy sledges they would have to drag by hand. But their minds, ravaged by lead and despair, were broken. Alongside essential supplies like pemmican and tents, they packed an insane collection of useless weight. They hauled heavy boxes of silver cutlery, ornate candelabras, and brass instruments. They packed stacks of books bound in heavy leather. These weren't supplies, they were anchors. They were the relics of a civilization they would never see again, a desperate, irrational attempt to carry their old world with them into the void. Imagine the scene. A thin, shuffling line of skeletal men emerging from the ships into the blinding white light. Each step is an agony. Their bodies are screaming with pain. They begin to pull the sledges, ropes digging into their bony shoulders. The grinding sound of the runners on the ice is the only sound besides the ceaseless wind. The ships, their only homes for 3 agonizing years, grow smaller behind them. Ahead of them is nothing. Nothing but an endless expanse of ice. A horizon that promises no rescue, no warmth, no life. Their long march into oblivion had begun. The march was a death sentence, and every man knew it. The grinding sound of the sledge runners on the ice was their funeral dirge. Each day, the line of skeletal figures grew shorter. The heavy silver cutlery, a mad reminder of a civilized world, was the first to be abandoned. A man would stumble, and a box of silver forks would slide from his grasp, a useless glitter against the white. No one stopped to help. They couldn't. Helping another man meant condemning yourself. Then the books went, their leather covers freezing solid, their stories of other worlds a cruel joke in this empty one. Soon, all they were dragging were their own dying bodies. When a man fell, that was it. The line kept moving. There were no goodbyes, no final words, just the shuffling of feet moving away. His comrades would just watch him become a smaller, dark shape on the ice until the white glare swallowed him completely. To stop was to die with him. The only instinct left was to keep walking south. The sun, which should have been a sign of life, was a cruel enemy. It offered no warmth, only a blinding glare that reflected off the ice. It burned their eyes, making them snowblind, turning the world into a painful white haze. This haze hid the dangers, deep crevices that could swallow a man whole, and jagged ridges of pressure ice that tore at their worn-out boots and shattered, exhausted ankles. Then, the last of the food ran out. Starvation was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was a fire in their bellies, a constant gnawing agony that twisted their insides and erased all other thoughts. It burned away memory, loyalty, honor. It reduced them to the most primal version of themselves. And here, in the final act of their tragedy, it drove them over the edge. They looked at each other with new eyes. The man who fell was no longer a comrade. He was survival. They broke the ultimate taboo. To walk another mile, to see another sunrise, they did the unthinkable. The search parties that came years later found the proof. They found bones in cooking pots. They saw the knife marks on human remains, clear, methodical cuts that spoke of a chilling, calculated necessity, not frenzied madness. This was the final horror of the Franklin expedition. Not just that they died, but how they were forced to live. They never reached the Great Fish River. They never found the fur trading post that was their ghost of a hope. The search parties that came years later found the proof. They found bones in cooking pots. They saw the knife marks on human remains, clear, methodical cuts that spoke of a chilling, calculated necessity, not frenzied madness. This was the final horror of the Franklin expedition. Not just that they died, but how they were forced to live. They never reached the Great Fish River. They never found the fur trading post that was their ghost of a hope. They simply walked south until their bodies gave out. One by one, they fell. Some alone, a single frozen statue in the vastness. Some in small groups, huddled together for warmth that wasn't there. The last of them died on a barren stretch of coastline, a place now known forever as Starvation Cove. Imagine being the last man. The others are all gone. You are a single, dark speck in an infinite, silent world of white. The wind is the only voice you've heard for days. Do you lie down and wait for the end? Or do you keep walking, driven by some primal instinct that refuses to die? What were the final thoughts of that last survivor? Was it a memory of a warm English home, a face of a loved one, or was it just a blank, frozen emptiness? We will never know. The Arctic keeps its secrets. For years, the world wondered. In London, they were heroes lost in the noble pursuit of discovery. Dozens of search missions were sent, but the vast white continent gave up nothing. But the real story was already being told around Inuit fires. The local hunters had seen them. They told stories of the asterisk kablunas, the white men, staggering across the ice like ghosts. They described men with hollow eyes and blackened gums, dragging heavy sledges with a desperate, unseeing gaze. The Inuit knew this land. They knew how to read the ice, how to hunt the seal, how to survive. The British had brought the world's most advanced technology, but the Inuit had knowledge. In the end, only one of those mattered. The mystery haunted the world for over 160 years. The men were gone. The ships had vanished. Then, in 2014, a sonar screen on a modern search vessel flickered. A dark shape emerged from the murky depths. It was the Erebus. 2 years later, its sister, HMS Terror, was found 70 kilometers away, sitting upright on the seabed, almost perfectly preserved in the freezing water. A ghost ship, its windows intact, its deck eerily clear, as if the crew had just stepped away. The discovery deepened the mystery. The ships were found far south of where they were abandoned. Had a skeleton crew, in a final, desperate gamble, tried to sail them out? Or did the shifting ice carry these floating tombs on a final, silent voyage after their crews were long dead? The discovery of the ships brought a close to the search, but not to the story. The fate of the men remains one of history's most chilling warnings. They faced the most hostile environment on Earth with the best technology of their time, and the environment won. It broke them completely. It stripped away their civilization, their sanity, and in the end, their very humanity. What do you think was their single biggest mistake? Was it the poisoned food or the decision to abandon the ships? Let us know your theory in the comments below. These are the stories that remind us of the thin line between survival and oblivion. To make sure you don't miss our next investigation into the unknown, subscribe to the channel.